Professor Engin Isin. He's a thinker who's been hugely influential on, for me in my thinking about citizenship, sort of theoretically and also ethnographically. He's been a professor of social science and at the Canada Research Chair at York University, and a professor of politics at the Open University, but he joined Queen Mary University of London in 2017. He's undertaken historical and political sociological studies of British imperial and colonial practices in Africa, America, Asia, and the Middle East, Ottoman imperial and colonial practices in Europe and the Middle East and North Africa, and French colonialism in Quebec, Haiti, and Algeria. He's also conducted historical sociology of citizenship in Canada and Europe. He says that the driving force in all his studies has been the tension between imperial, colonial, or national designs for conduct of people, and how people subvert these designs by performative acts, and how they invent political subjectivities. This is the tension he often explores in how people constitute themselves as international citizens. And I must say, it's that's been especially influential to my thinking, but I would extend that, and maybe we'll explore that later, to not just international citizens, but actually citizens at all scales. One of the things that I found very productive is Engin's kind of theoretical explorations of scalar thinking, actually. He has a couple of recent publications or publications that are just about to be published, where he's talking about being digital citizens. So together with Evelyn Ruppert, he's produced the second edition of the book called Being Digital Citizens, which is open access, published by Rowman and Littlefield. We will somehow put these links in the program of the research series. Which discusses the continued tensions as well as the interdependence between political activism and corporate and political power in cyberspace. And Maurice, and even just about to be published next week, in Data, next week I think, or shortly anyway, in Data and Society, another article that they've written together called The Birth of Sensory Power, How a Pandemic Made It Visible, published in Big Data and Society, sorry. And it's about data politics, and the pandemic and the forms of power associated with data politics. So super interesting stuff. But today he's especially going to be focusing on the theme of our seminar series. It's a fantastic start to this seminar series. And the paper he's going to share with us today is titled Decolonizing Citizenship. So over to you, Engin. Oh, we need to unmute you, yeah. Fantastic.
Thanks very much, Sean, and thank you for the invitation. I'm really delighted to be here and starting this series. The series looks awesome, and I look forward to participating and listening to the upcoming discussions and talks. And thanks so much to also Sarah, who couldn't be here, and Emiliano, and to the center in general. And thanks everyone for showing up in cyberspace somewhere and beaming in to this streaming. I'm really delighted to be able to talk to the topic of decolonizing citizenship, because it has been a concern of mine for some time now. And this has allowed me to just put together a statement in terms of what does it mean for me to think about decolonizing citizenship, and in what ways my work participate in that collective project. It is an interesting moment in time in terms of politics of citizenship. On one hand, we see citizenship for sale. Many countries have started programs such as investment migration and other investment programs through which they sell citizenship in a way marketed, commodified, bundle of rights that are actually provided to people who already have privileges to be able to afford them. And yet at the same time, we also see a politics of borders and closing of borders to certain types of people, refugees on the Mediterranean, in the Balkan route in case of Europe, and in the US-Mexico border and various other border zones and frontiers, we see increasingly people's movements being controlled and people being pushed into precarious positions. So there's a tension and a paradox of this institution of citizenship. On the one hand, it provides opportunities, rights, possibilities, and yet on the other hand, it becomes restrictive, controlling, and denying and excluding of certain possibilities for other people. Arguably, that this is not really new. It is really in the center of what citizenship is as an institution. On the one hand, a glorified version of liberal democratic citizenship rights have been provided over the past century or so. And yet at the same time, more recently, we have seen a literature calling into question of the ways in which citizenship functions simultaneously, inclusion and exclusion. I suggest that decolonizing citizenship also should not be considered as a critique of citizenship or revealing the paradoxes of citizenship. Not only a one angle, but at least three movements towards citizenship as a critical practice or critical understanding. Three movements can be understood as three moments as well, but particularly in the last 20 years, I think we have become more aware of how these three moments have been articulated. One, I call it deconstructing its universalism. The kind of work that began in 1989, which I will come to, but revealed an able-bodied, male, propertied, white, heterosexual, and Christian figure at the center of this figure of citizenship, and deconstructing it has been going on for some time. And the second moment is historicizing its modernity. Modern citizenship has constituted itself as a model citizenship, but by exposing slavery, colonialism, and its development, literature in the last 20 years has called into question that narrative of citizenship. And the third one is also an important part of it is overturning its exclusions. Various practical, performative, direct actions have overturned various exclusions by making rights claims and radically transforming the modern states and its regime of rights. And I will give some examples. So I'm going to speak in turn each of these, and then given these three moments, where we are and how do we understand citizenship, given that we understand these three movements or three moments of critique that we have experienced, especially in the last 20 years. Let me start with deconstructing its universalism, as I mentioned, by revealing an able-bodied, male, propertied, white, heterosexual, and Christian figure that constitutes the core of that figure we call modern citizen. It's really the starting point probably is Iris Marion Young in 1989, who wrote an influential article, and at least influential on me, critique of universal idea of citizenship. Coming from a feminist point of view, Iris Marion Young articulated very clearly that one of the paradoxes of citizenship is that one, although it is constituted and presented as a universal ideal that is applicable for everyone in any given polity, and then it has this element of rule of law and universalism by virtue of inclusion, in actual practice, coming from particular feminist point of view, she argued very strongly that citizenship does also function in ways that it excludes differentiated exclusions. Of course, a case in point is women and their exclusion from the political arena for a very long period of time. If we want to stretch it historically, perhaps 2,000 years, reaching back to ancient Greece and moving on to Roman citizenship and early modern and modern versions. And only recently in the 20th century, really, women have been able to constitute themselves as political subjects although in differentiated ways. So it is a very recent experience. When you think about 1989, when Iris Young published that article, it enveloped a period where in 1949, interestingly, exactly 40 years before, T.H. Marshall's influential lecture on citizenship and social class, where he drew a very different image, a very different portrait of citizenship, where 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries citizenship has increasingly become universal, a linear progress line, where in the 20th century, finally, working class has been able to participate in the political arena. Iris Young's take 40 years later was really different. Not only did she not see a progress of citizenship reaching increasingly a universal model, but actually strided situation, citizenship where inclusions and exclusions were part of the strategy and development of citizenship in the nation state. So that's very interesting. The 40 years is also the 40 years that we have increasingly become aware of this strided, fragmented nature of citizenship that functions with inclusions and exclusions. But I would like to push the frame of deconstructing citizenship even to its origins. From the moment that it was declared to be universal, if you want to take 1789, the French Declaration of the Universal Rights of Man and Citizens, right at that very moment of declaration, Olympe de Gouges in 1791 already made the first foray into deconstructing that idea of universality by writing the rights of women in a subversive way and in a playful way, but in a very serious way. She asked really tough questions about the universality of the declaration and how is it that universal did not include certain identities, certain groups, and certain social formations, as it were. And she already, from the very beginning, then I would say that deconstructing citizenship began almost at least modern citizenship began at the moment of its inception. And I would also extend that by way of also her critique. She was quite clear about the significance of slavery and the need for the abolition of slavery to be able to genuinely creating the rights of humans. She was interested in rights of humans as political subjects. And Toussaint Louverture, across the world, across the Atlantic, what became known to be Haiti, was leading a slave revolt against French Empire. And in the end, the Constitution of Haiti was one of the most advanced and the progressive constitutions when it was eventually enacted. And Toussaint Louverture was really a key figure as a freed slave leading a slave revolt to rewrite the terms of citizenship to include Black people and colonized people in it. The experiment may not have lasted long, but its reverberations lasted much longer than its actual accomplishments. So deconstructing citizenship actually began 200 years ago at the very inception of modern citizenship. Of course, it has been intensified in the last 40 years and 20 years in different frames, but it is good to keep that in mind. Then I would still extend this 200-year frame to 2,000 years. There has been really veritable and significant literature by ancient historians, ancient Greek historians, ancient Roman historians, and early modern scholarship who have bit by bit, piece by piece, deconstructed the homogeneous and progressive linear development of citizenship. And they have shown, for example, how ancient Greek citizenship also functioned through series of exclusion of women, slaves, merchants, sailors. In the case of ancient Roman Republican and imperial citizenship, exclusions of plebeians, the poor, the slaves, and how each of those identities, each of those social groups in turn struggle to find a space for themselves to express political subjectivity, claim the rights they didn't have, claim the rights that they weren't necessarily given, but the rights that they have taken. So we have seen narratives coming out of early modern scholarship, ancient Roman and ancient Greek citizenship in the last 20 years that has changed our views of citizenship in the last 2,000 years. This work is still continuing in a very strong vein, I must say. I have been to various conferences, ancient Roman historians, ancient Greek historians, early modern historians, and in interaction with them, I am really, really inspired by the work that is now available on citizenship that 20 years ago was not available. So deconstructing citizenship is really a significant moment of that decolonizing, but it is only one moment. The other moment that I'm going to just open it up a little bit, historicizing its modernity. I already mentioned early modern, ancient Roman and ancient Greek historians deconstructing citizenship, taking it apart, and then putting it together in different narratives. But particularly colonial historians and historians of empires have done enormous work, significant work, historicizing modernity of citizenship by exposing slavery and colonialism as the core of its foundations. Particularly, they've taken apart a grand narrative that I'm going to outline in a minute, and then I'm going to show you the kind of work I've done to participate in historicizing that grand narrative. The grand narrative that I'm speaking about is this notion that the birth of the nation state and the age of nationalism are often described as a long century from the age of revolution, 1780s, to the in the late 18th century until the beginning of the 20th century. This is the long 18th century or long 19th century, however you want to frame and temporalize it. This is the modern conception of nation state, and it is given often as a narrative of displacement, if not replacement, of empires. So nation states, the grand narrative has been that are often seen as emerging out of crumbling and dissolving empires. Empires gave way to 200 nation states, as it were, around the world. And this came at the onset of crumbling of the colonial rule. But over the last 20 years, a literature, historians, imperial historians, colonial historians, historians of settler colonialism, extraterritorial colonialism, has increasingly shown that it has also been in this era of the so-called nation state that new forms of imperialism have emerged and persisted into the present. That has raised the specter whether nationalism and imperialism are actually opposites or they are complementary movements. If that's the case, if they are in fact complementary movements, that has profound effects for the ways in which we understand modern nation state citizenship. It now appears to us with this work for the last 20 years, that empire states such as, we call them now empire states rather than nation states, Britain, France, and Germany actively encouraged nationalism, both home and abroad, as a strategy for governing statuses and actively encouraging the formation of post-colonial yet imperial nations. Imperial in the sense that these newly formed post-colonial nations still remained within the orbit of imperial control and influence, yet each aspiring to the people, territory, and sovereignty principle. So the scene is quite complex in terms of understanding so-called era of the nation states. And that changes also our view of how to understand, historicize the modern conception of citizenship, which up until, and this is also Marshall's particular view, is that up until recently, narrative of citizenship has been given as an internalist narrative. Each nation state had their own narrative, whereas it is possible to draw out a global, if not international, history of citizenship from the point of view of new empire states creating new kinds of spheres of influence. I'm going to mention quickly and acknowledge the significant work that Hannah Arendt did on particular this, and I'm quite inspired by her work in 1940s. This is before she wrote The Origins of Modern Totalitarianism, where she does talk about citizenship and nationalism. But in 1940s, she did really do some significant work where she rejected the idea of a transition from imperialism to nationalism in the modern period and saw the two connected with each other. Written several years before the publication of The Origins, Arendt published a series of articles in which she made the argument that rather than being opposites, imperialism was really an instigator of the kind of nationalism that emerged in the late 19th and early 20th century. So it was a history of citizenship, incipient history of citizenship that Arendt provided that, but did not follow through, was a more from the point of view of imperial, global, internationalist perspective, rather than nationalist perspective of giving each the development of nation state as though it was an insular and independent development. There are significant consequences of that. In my work, archival work that I've done on extraterritoriality, I explore this particular hypothesis. I'm going to say a little bit about this. Particularly, I shared an article and a chapter I published under the title Citizenship's Empire, where I investigated extraterritoriality laws in the early 20th century. And again, there is significant colonial historical scholarship that opened up, starting with Laura Benton and others following through, extraterritoriality laws, how this mechanism of empire states actually build peoples at a distance as governing objects. So we often have the predominant image of imperialism and colonialism through settler colonialism, requiring actually settlement. And that obviously was a significant element of colonialism in the 19th century and 20th centuries. But there was another form of colonialism that has significant influence on the development of citizenship, and that doesn't go in the literature with the name colonialism. It was called extraterritoriality laws. These laws particularly pertain to Chinese and Ottoman empires. There are two empires today in world history that claim to have never been colonized. They may have crumbled, they may have disappeared, they may have been reformed, and they may have continued in different forms, but each makes a claim that they were not colonized. This is for a good reason. They were not colonized in the same sense in which we understand settler colonialism. And yet, on the other hand, when you look at late 19th century and the early 20th century in China, in Chinese empire, how American, French, German, and British empires actually colonized China with extraterritorial laws, and in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries in Ottoman Empire. The process is too complex. I've shared the chapter, and I hope you will have a chance to read it. But to give you just a sense of that chapter, what I was trying to do with particular hypothesis in mind, the relationship between nationalism and imperialism, is to see how and through what mechanisms each empire build a constituency at a distance or a people at a distance. What happened with extraterritorial laws, originally protecting merchants, diplomats, and other travelers, these laws became increasingly governing technology whereby subjects living under jurisdictions, under distant jurisdictions, were claimed to belong to European empires. So the British Empire began making claims to people in Ottoman Empire, saying that they're British people. And these British people should come be subsumed under British law. It should not be various activities that they undertake in Ottoman Empire should not be the purview of Ottoman laws, but they are British people. Similarly, French did participate in that. German Empire, incipient German Empire in the 19th century also participate in that. So various empires began making claims to peoples in other jurisdictions, particularly in China and Ottoman Empire. The conclusion from this, one of the tentative conclusions I drew, is that people were created at a distance. People with loyalty coming under the subsumption of another law, another jurisdiction, developing a certain affiliation and affinity with a distant homeland. Even the very idea of homeland may well have originated with the relationship of nationalism and imperialism, because it has created in the minds of, in the hearts of, in the bodies of these people that at a distance it claimed, produced, and habituated into certain ways of thinking that there was a home, an empire state, and they were generating, they were disseminated from that home. But in actual fact, many of the people that they claimed were not necessarily disseminated from a center, and they were migrants in any simple sense. There were generations of people who were living in both empires via various arrangements. The scene is very complex, but I hope that I have given you a gist of what is at stake with historicizing citizenship in the modern state. Now, the third moment is the overturning its exclusions. That, as Sean mentioned, an aspect of my work is to look at and explore the tension between imperial and colonial designs and state designs of citizenship, and imposing certain disciplinary and, on the one hand, and coercive measures on people to produce certain forms of habits in them as proper and good citizens. I've been always interested in how citizens themselves or non-citizens subvert these and make claims to citizenship under radically transformed new terms, and they become critical of regimes of rights in which they find themselves. Of course, there's so many examples of this I have written about, and there's voluminous literature now in the last 20 years of making rights claims by those people who don't have the right, at least on paper, to make right claims. But two that have been really significant more recently. One is sans-papiers, those who are without papers making claims to citizenship. That has been going on for 20 years, maybe even longer, but it's gathering momentum, and there are various movements that support that kind of making rights claims to various jurisdictions on the basis of rights that one does not have, or on the basis of rights that one puts together as a portfolio of rights, such as human rights, international law, and various other sources to constitute themselves as citizens as yet without that right, citizens yet to come, as it were. And this has been a significant element of, if you like, performative citizenship, or if you like, overturning citizenship, or even subversive citizenship. Sans-papiers has been really, really consequential, and it has cascaded through various forms of politics. Today, so many activists declare solidarity with sans-papiers across many jurisdictions, and we get to hear the kinds of acts that they undertake to push the envelope of what it means to be a citizen in any given state. And then the other one, really significant one I want to single out, is Black Lives Matter. Obviously, just like any complex movement, it does not mean one single thing. It gathers together various claims under that umbrella. It makes it possible to advance major rights claims, and yet at the same time, it has the capacity to gather together certain forms of mobilization. and Black Lives Matters actually pick up from where Toussaint Louverture actually started, and Olympique de Gouges herself continued. And there's a long-running activism about anti-slavery, anti-racist forms of politics, and asking hard questions about what is it about modern nation state that constitutes its citizenship by excluding along color line. It used to be called Jean de I can't say it in French. The people with color. It's an original French term that actually started this movement, and that's been 200 years. So that Black Lives Matters, what it signifies, what it opens up historically, is a third moment of colonizing citizenship. So these three moments of, on one hand, deconstructing, on the other hand, historicizing, and on the other, overturning, have been really significant. The question I want to pose is that given now this history of decolonizing citizenship, today when we're entering into citizenship, how do we describe it? How do we define it? How do we give a different meaning? If we are critiquing grand narratives of modern nation state and grand narratives of universal citizenship, and we are striding them, differentiating them, fragmenting them, and demonstrating that citizenship functions through, performs its strategies through both inclusions and exclusions, how do we give an account of it? Where do we start? What are the red lines by which we work, and we reject certain descriptions of it? And this is what I've done in an article that I've also shared. It has not yet been published, but I've shared. I was given the task of defining citizenship, but instead of defining, probably with these three moments, I have deconstructed it and historicized it and mentioned overturning but particularly exploration ought to begin, not end. These are the beginning propositions where citizenship takes into account its decolonizing and overturning moments. So these five are in any order you can have them. Arbitrary involves political and social struggles over who may and may not act as a subject of rights. That is, to have a right to be recognized as a person before the law. In other words, one cannot given with what citizenship is, but what a particular social and political struggle produces at any given space. Without giving an account of that struggle that constitutes citizenship, there isn't really any methodological gain to be made by accepting what citizenship is at any given moment. So that dynamic social and political struggle has to be given an account at any given jurisdiction, any given polity. We cannot do away with that. To have a right to be recognized as a person before the law is always an outcome of a social and political struggle, sometimes centuries long, sometimes a decade long, sometimes a few years long. Duration has to be an object of exploration. The second key component is that these struggles feature not only citizens, but also non-citizens as relational categories of person. In other words, when we are looking at citizenship as an outcome of political and social struggles, we cannot just think, and the word actually leads us to think, is that this is happening between and among citizens themselves. That citizenship struggle is about for and citizens, and it does not include non-citizens. Non-citizens, used citizens enter into struggles already in relationship to those who define citizenship in a particular way. So as I mentioned in the deconstructing mode, for example, if citizenship defined as white male Christian heterosexual able-bodied figure, then anything that is the other of these figures as non-citizens enter into struggle and ask the question why. Why citizenship is constituted through these exclusions. So these struggles feature always citizens and non-citizens. So when we do talk about citizenship and its struggles today, it does include refugees. It does include new forms of slavery. It does include racialized subjects and racialization processes. You cannot and we cannot exclude those from the analysis. The third proposition is citizens and non-citizens, in the way in which I have spoken about, members of different social groups making rights claims. So the intersectionality of citizenship, various social groups constituting differentiated forms of both citizens and non-citizens is also important. So when we say that citizens and non-citizens are struggling over rights, it is only partially correct, and it's only analytically acceptable that we state it that way. It is actually more like how a Black woman, lesbian, not able-bodied person struggles in various fields of life for inclusion, for various forms of discrimination, against certain forms of racialization, misogyny, and so on. So it is a very complicated field when these struggles take place and play themselves out. Intersectionality is a significant component of understanding the relationship between citizenship and non-citizenship and the tension between them. Fourth one is that people become citizens by exercising, claiming, and performing rights and duties. This sounds sort of a repetition of the first and second propositions, but bear with me, it isn't. It is distinct claim, a distinct proposition from the other. This is, if you like, the practical aspect of citizenship, that many rights that may or may not exist on paper have to be performed to actually bring into being and push the envelope of what is doable, what is not doable, under what description one can act as a citizen. So the performative aspect of exercising and claiming and practicing rights and duties is significant. There are many rights that may exist on paper unless they are actually performed in practice. We cannot say that they performatively exist. They may exist in paper, but not necessarily in practice. And vice versa, people may bring certain rights into being without necessarily having been authorized by any given theoretical, legal, on-paper guarantee that by performatively, people bring rights into existence. This is the significant aspect of making rights claims. And finally, the fifth proposition is that when people become citizens, they creatively transform its meanings and functions by making rights claims. Again, one might consider that this fifth proposition has overlapping aspects with the four, but I'm going to suggest that it is also distinct. And it's the following. It is really important to think citizenship dynamically, because every time that it plays out, it already changes its meaning. When people, by making rights claims, constitute themselves as citizens, already what it means to be a citizen has transformed its meaning. When people without papers actually constitute themselves as citizens or like citizens and make certain rights claims, already they have transformed citizenship in a given polity. They have expanded boundaries. They have deepened, resignified its function to perform it differently, to make it function differently. It is not what it was before the enactment of citizenship. This is also an aspect of decolonizing citizenship. When Indigenous people in Canada make claims, even against citizenship, as First Nations, they make certain land rights, land claims. They make claims to Canada as being First Nations. They constitute themselves as political subjects across the spectrum. They work with environmentalists, ecologists in struggles such as in 2012, 2013 struggle in Idle No More. When they engage in these struggles, Indigenous peoples, they are not simply making claims to citizenship as it exists. This is often we forget. They have already made a change. They have already made a transformation in the way in which begin to understand citizenship. They have already acted like citizens, even though on paper they may or may not be actual citizens of Canada. Similarly, in Australia and the US, Indigenous people, when they make claims, or in Africa, they already make a significant transformation of that institution by very act of instituting themselves as political subjects. Now, I want to end my talk and to open up for discussion in terms of where we are politically today. If we are talking about, I have given various frames of deconstructing citizenship. Sometimes I talked about 20 years, sometimes I talked about 40 years, I talked about 200 years and 2,000 years. These are different frames in which to think about decolonizing citizenship. It is important to think that decolonizing citizenship is recent, but also it is significant to identify what recent innovations have been brought to bear to keep the concept as a live concept that has transformative capacities. Where do we stand here in terms of the political project of decolonizing citizenship? If we are entering into it from various angles, various perspectives, where do we stand in different jurisdictions and especially on a world scale? I'm afraid the scene is not very hopeful or it's certainly inspiring in terms of various political struggles that are taking place, but it is not hopeful, or not immediately so, in the sense that all the reactive forces for this project of decolonizing citizenship have gathered strength also in the last 20 years, perhaps in reaction to decolonizing citizenship project. It should not be underestimated how reactionary nationalism, how nationalist chauvinism, how far-right fascism, how far-right understanding of autochthonous citizenship, nativism, have also taken root in the very same period in the last 20 years where I'm arguing that decolonizing citizenship has taken place. I think we ought not to think of them as independent, but the relationship and how that plays out is a matter of empirical exploration. So it is not a question of simple argument saying that because decolonizing citizenship as a project has taken hold, that reactionary nationalism has emerged. I think there's an element of it, but back to the historicizing discussion or moment of decolonizing citizenship, the relationship between nationalism and imperialism, and the relationship between nationalism and globalization, if we twist them around and no longer think of them as binary opposites, but actually mutually complementary processes, very much like in the beginning, I made observations on how citizenship has become an industry and now it is for sale, for providing opportunities and possibilities for people who can afford it. One could subsume that under a global citizenship narrative, that citizenship is globalizing for those who can actually afford it. And yet at the same time, it is becoming increasingly autochthonous, nativist, by drawing boundaries around certain nationalities, peoplehoods, and so on, and excluding people from those by various discussions of first come, first serve conception of nativism, or invented notions of homeland, invented notions of tradition. But these two developments, these two movements ought not to be thought necessarily as opposites, but perhaps feeding into one another. That there's certain forms of globalization or forms of imperialism that actually rely on maintaining local tribalisms to be able to foment certain globalized conceptions of citizenship. In other words, if citizenship is on for sale as global citizenship, that sale to take place, it depends on certain tribal closed, enclosed boundaries that actually sells it. So if Malta and Cyprus were engaged in investment migration policies, which both have been suspended recently, partly because they also enacted a market for privilege has been created into which a global market can enter. The two are not really as separate developments. So where we are today is also very complex, and it throws up really significant challenges for anyone who wants to actively involve in decolonizing citizenship project, and at the same time also actively engaged in decolonizing citizenship as a theoretical project. I'm going to end there. I'm not sure how long I have spoken. I hope not too long, but enough to give us an opportunity to have ample time for questions and discussion and comments. I welcome all your thoughts. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Engin. That's fabulous. Really lots of food for thought. I'm going to abuse the chair's privilege to make the first comment, although we already do have a question coming in, but please, the rest of you do think up your questions and either put them in the chat or put your hand up in the participants sort of sidebar bit. There's so much going on there. There's so much to grapple with. I'm particularly interested in and finding very, very productive this pointing out of the necessity of the relationship between nation state and empire in this kind of complex way throughout history and this sort of the new imperialisms. But I've got I think two questions. I'll start with actually the one that possibly the less well thought through one, which might be a bit more kind of conceptual, I don't know, which is in the way that you're talking about extraterritoriality and contemporary imperialisms and the relationship to the national. Just interested to push a little bit more to ask you about what kind of theory of kind of scale and spatiality is underlying your thought here. See, I'm not a geographer. I'm a social anthropologist. So I may be asking a geographer's question sort of in a half kind of way. But I found it really interesting just to sort of think about the kinds of spatialities that you're talking about and to sort of try and imagine them as we think about political systems today. Because I was starting to wonder what kind of mechanisms of power make these kinds of spatialities possible. What I mean by that is that it's really easy to see with settler colonialism what kinds of mechanisms of power make that particular form of spatiality and imperialism work. It's violence, it's dispossession and so on. Extraterritoriality historically, and I think perhaps in sort of contemporary terms, contemporary forms of imperialism, rely on, I think, potentially quite different forms of power. And I'd be interested to, if you feel like it, for you to explore that. The second question is, I just wondered, you're talking about the kind of dynamism of citizenship's meanings, but for you, it's very strongly associated with rights and rights claims, and maybe rights and duties. And I just wonder whether this is quite a Marshallian notion of citizenship, and just partly to kind of, again, in a sort of a historical sense as well as a spatial sense, you know, the way that people understood rights, or the way that rights might have been 2,000 years ago in ancient citizenship, is not the same as kind of the understandings of rights now. So could we imagine a kind of citizenship that didn't rely so much on rights as such in the way that you're talking about, but some other form of kind of political language of belonging?
Thanks, Sean. Those are really two great questions. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to do justice to them, because both of them really pack significant questions. I wish we had so much more time to be able to just unpack just those two concepts, extraterritoriality and the question of rights. On extraterritoriality, I really I'm very happy to hear the way you framed it, because there is a sense in which juxtaposing it to settler colonialism, not because it is somehow more benign version, but a distinct version, I think is a significant move. And that's what I wanted to capture, that extraterritoriality is a different kind of imperialism that perhaps escaped attention that it deserves. And what kinds of mechanisms that it uses, it is really quite complex and variegated. Law is definitely quite a function of it, but by virtue of law and declaring jurisdiction over people who are at a distance or functioning at a distance is an element of that. But also it functions through geographical imagination, that in distant people can be constituted as members of a polity without necessarily having to live within the actual boundaries and borders of that jurisdiction. That's why I'm thinking of, along with a number of colonial historians, this concept of empire state for modern formations rather than nation state, that these empire states actually create patchworks of nationhood in various parts of the world. One example is, there was a few years ago with citizenship studies, we were having a debate about a special issue, possibly about how China has changed its an incipient empire, if not fully functioning empire at the moment, along with other empires, also using extraterritoriality as well as settler colonialism in different forms. China has changed over the last 20 years one of its policies of not necessarily being concerned about diasporic Chinese people into being very concerned about constituting diasporic Chinese people as its own by various mechanisms such as taxation, remittances, allowing for certain rights that diasporic Chinese people did not have. And it turns out that China also learned these strategies and technologies from other jurisdictions that have been doing similar, claiming people at a distance, constituting people at a distance. It really is worth looking at in more detail, this extraterritoriality mechanism of constituting people at a distance. You mentioned that the geographer, you're not a geographer, and I am a geographer, and I think geographically, even though if I'm practicing political theory or political philosophy or genealogy, I think very much through space, but extraterritoriality is a kind of concept that allows us to understand polities being formed beyond borders, traversing borders in a patchwork form, and that does not resemble the kind of political map that we have come to internalize or inhabit, that political system of states that present itself as the cartographic representation of the world. It is very different. If one were to really visualize extraterritorial power and how various empire states constitute people at a distance, that visualized map would look very different. It would be very interesting to see. For those of you who have an interest in how it might be visualized, you may want to look at the cover page of our book called Data Politics, and that's actually by a Canadian visual artist. We had long conversations about how that actually, what she described there as an artist, what she expressed there as an artist, is so close to this patchwork of territorialities that in which we live. This is just by way of really acknowledging how important your question is, but not really having answered it. The question of rights is even more complex. This is really a long-running debate in political philosophy, in political theory, particularly from the point of view of post-structuralism, deconstructive turn. Can we really use rights to describe political subjectivity that's associated with liberal democratic rights, or at least modern rights, that are constituted, A, from an individual point of view, they're individualized, and B, they are privatized, right, as possessed entity for people to be able to enjoy and benefit. And the example of citizenship for sale is a good example of privatized right that is distributed and marketized and commodified in that sense. And then if that's the situation, in a deconstructed, overturned, historicized conception of right, is it possible? If not, then why maintain it as a language of politics? Perhaps we have to maintain other languages of politics. I'm quite yet undetermined about this question. I am not sure. I've been thinking about it for a while now, and yet I would not be able to give a definitive answer saying that, yes, we can find a language beyond rights, and that would be actually a more progressive than thinking, for example, indigenous politics beyond rights, because indigenous politics perhaps can be conceived without a language of rights, or even those people who say for us to be able to talk about politics of citizenship, maybe even we should abandon the notion of citizenship. I have sympathies for both ways of thinking about, and I have seen various versions of rights that are being talked about. I could give some names and examples and so on, but that would take us too much time. But let's park this also as a really significant political question for us to think about, for those of us who are practically and theoretically engaged with the question of decolonizing citizenship. Then coming back to the very end of my discussion, where are we now and what do we do with the concept and the baggage that comes with it, which is the language of rights?
Thanks very much. So I can see about 6 or 7 questions in the chat and one hand up so far. So I'm going to start with, I'll just take it in order, I think. More coming in as we go. But so the first question is from Gibson Silva, saying how to decolonize society or education in post-colonial countries in order to overcome exclusion. What is the role of emancipation and autonomy in the world of citizenship's empire? That's the first one. Engin, would you like to maybe take a few questions at once or one at a time? What do you think? You're muted, Engin. Hold on. Engin, we need you to unmute.
Finally, what I was saying, that I am trying to unmute myself. My mouse pointer is jumping around without any control over it. So it was a freaky moment of, I cannot control my mouse. Okay, if I can't control my mouse, what else I can control? Not much. By way of giving a description of, so should we take 3 questions? Actually, it would be good, like bundling them up. And the first question is very well noted about the question of autonomy and emancipation.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so let me read out the others as well, just for the sake of the recording, should we use them. What we'll do, I'll take 2 more questions from the chat, hand over to Engin, and then go to the person with the hand up and then come back to the chat. So the next question is, thanks for talking, from Shuling. Thanks for talking about the history and possible definitions of citizenship. but could you give more insights about how to decolonize citizenship? And the third question from Priscilla Breton is, in Decolonizing Citizenship, how do we balance the quest for global citizenship, where the focus is on equality of rights amongst all people, and multiculturalism, where the focus is on special rights for specific groups, for example, women and other marginalized groups? Okay, over to you.
Thank you. Three really good questions. Let's see if I can cut into them as succinctly as possible. About autonomy and emancipation, this actually really goes to the heart of where my heart is when studying citizenship. I am very much interested in people who take rights or take situations into their hands, articulate how they want to be political, articulate how they want to conduct their lives, articulate how they want to articulate with other people, how they form solidarities, and define their own activities in their own terms as it develops with their interaction with others. So interaction with others, significant. Autonomy, one group's autonomy may well be lacking of autonomy for another group. So the autonomy, only insofar as it's understood in relational terms, that is a value for me, value of citizenship. So that is really dear to my heart as a political project, that notion of autonomy. It is also a key to understand emancipation, because emancipation cannot be in terms given by the dominant. Overturning the values that dominate people, overturning the values that extract subservience from people, certain forms of slavery, either physical or mental slavery from people, don't necessarily lead to emancipation. Emancipation means being able to call them into question in the first place and overturn them practically in the second place. And this is much more difficult said than done in various forms. When we think about specific fields in which this can be asked, in citizenship of nation states or certain polities, it is very difficult to create a politics of openness and at the same time politics of commitment and solidarity. How is it that autonomy is going to be functioning and performing? One could say that Brexit is about autonomy, taking our control back, it says, taking our sovereignty back. It's an autonomous citizen politics. It comes as a result of a referendum, democratically and constitutionally legitimate referendum. And yet, many people will not accept Brexit as an example of emancipation because it is based on certain exclusions, an exceptional idea of nationhood, exceptional idea of selfhood, closed borders, and not necessarily being interested in the fate of others and our interrelated fates that come together, thrown together in the space in which we live. Brexit politics is not a politics of solidarity from an internationalist point of view. And yet its language is autonomous and in terms of taking sovereignty back. How do we square the circle? How do we define what is progressive and promising? And it is for emancipation of us as humans in the world, inhabiting this earth, understanding our codependency, interdependency, and our common fate and shared future. And not only dependency on each other, but dependency on the resources, possibilities that the earth provides. How do we square the circle and identify? So a number of things we could say that certain form of cosmopolitanism is significant in establishing a notion of autonomy and nationhood as possibilities of emancipation. Certain forms of anti-racism that it cannot be based on racism and otherness. It cannot be based on creating hierarchies of people, those who deserve and those who don't deserve. That it cannot be based on the basis of inequality that is already instituted and institutionalized. Any kind of autonomous action that contributes to institutionalizing and favors of certain particular people over others, establishes hierarchies, cannot possibly lead to emancipation. It can lead, and it will lead always, to other form of domination. So these are the red lines that I would draw in understanding. Do you want to call this a cosmopolitan attitude? As James Tully might call it, a practical attitude, an attitude toward global citizenship, understood differently. We can argue about the debate, but or naming or labeling, but the content. If a particular investment is to lead to emancipation as humanity, as our human capacities, emancipating our human possibilities, codependent with nature as well as with one another in the age of Anthropocene, then the red lines are it cannot be differentiated in hierarchizing, inequality, misogyny, racism, those kinds of politics. They have to be rejected. So even if forms of politics that acquire the language of autonomy have to be critiqued for its internal logic of actually anti-emancipation, it is leading to further forms of domination. Maybe this also leads to the second question. Can I give an example of decolonizing citizenship? I did not get the name of the person who posed the question, but would you not consider this an example of decolonizing thinking, decolonial thinking in terms of citizenship? That these are the lines, these are the propositions. It cannot possibly function, decolonizing citizenship, with racial categories instituting themselves in any form, but particularly in terms of hierarchies, constituting hierarchies, that it cannot participate in creating new forms of inequality. It cannot participate in certain forms of sexual politics that, again, hierarchical and differentiated in the sense that giving certain values over certain forms of sexuality and not other forms. These kinds of moves that we now know enough, that these are forms of domination that surround us. So we have to unpick each of these of domination singularly, but also comprehensively and totally. This is sort of the universal moment that Etienne Balibar talks about on universals, what kind of universals that we can build, and emancipation politics, and what kinds that we cannot follow. That's a decolonizing, but more specifically, decolonizing citizenship. If you want me to just quickly also show you where my investments are, we cannot decolonize citizenship without the histories of the second moment, histories of colonialism, imperialism, settler colonialism, global color line, and territorial or extraterritorial colonialism. These are significant investments in decolonizing citizenship. That's one of the proposition. The third question, if I understand it correctly, in terms of decolonizing citizenship, for example, what are we going to do with a category such as global citizenship as it comes up against different jurisdictions where it functions through multicultural citizenship, diversity, deep diversity, and other terms where it opens up possibilities for historically marginalized, historically dominated peoples, and it allows them space to find them space in the liberal democratic polities at least, or establish solidarities. Well, global citizenship is a contested category. I don't think it goes without saying that one should invest in it. There's global citizenship that is about for citizenship for sale. And there are people who think that when they're buying citizenship in the market, they're exercising some form of global citizenship, and that they are participating in global citizenship. What that means is that they're creating for themselves, for their families and for their class, opportunities that can be had right across the globe with as minimal friction as possible. Money is able to buy that. And yet at the same time, that global citizenship is creating certain forms of exclusion for it to operate, for people to be able to have those privileges. Various spaces have been constituted as hyper-privileged places, hyper-privileged spaces. And that hyper-privilege means closing borders, developing autochthonous and nativist ideologies, thinking that this is our homeland from the time immemorial, and these kinds of investments. So these two things go hand in hand together. So we cannot just invest in a concept of global citizenship without critically taking it apart and then pulling it all together again, saying that this is the kind of global citizenship that can have promises. This is the kind of citizenship that is decolonized and has possibilities. This is the kind of global citizenship that can lead to emancipation. This is the kind of global citizenship through which we can address global challenges, global significant battles today on climate change, on global arms trade, on global refugee policy, on global migrant policy. These major challenges, we can say, that can only be tackled when we take it apart and put it together and then say which ones have the emancipatory potential, which ones can establish transversal solidarities amongst peoples, and which ones don't constantly invite people to constitute themselves as somehow privileged, special, unequal, and better than others because of what? Race, ethnicity, language, nationhood. That can lead to all sorts of forms of new domination. That has to be rejected. That is, to me, decolonizing citizenship or politics of decolonizing project.
Thanks very much. Next person for a question is actually, can I invite Erica Teichert to pose your question, and then I'll read out a couple more questions from the chat.
Yes, hi. Thank you very much for your wonderful talk. I wanted to push you on the question of climate change specifically. So, you know, there are countries in Latin America, like Ecuador, for example, that have declared in their constitution that nature is a right-bearing subject. So the right to nature have been recognized in the constitution. And I wanted to know what possibilities you see for citizenship, for defending the natural world, thinking of the natural world as, even if we think of it as a right-bearing subject, it's not a subject that can make claims the same way that people can, right? So to what extent can the language of rights and perhaps citizenship be useful in thinking of nature as a subject that deserves protection in the same way that people do?
Well, thanks very much for your question. Climate change, ecosystems, ecological activism, environmental activism have been making significant contribution to our understanding of citizenship. But in terms of your question, the global citizenship, what possibilities are there? First off, the couple of works that come to mind, and I'd like to acknowledge them. One is Donna Haraway's work on When Species Meet. It is a significant work in the sense that in Anthropocene, how do we establish not only relationship with one another, but with species whom we can and we cannot understand, species whom can and cannot actually speak to us in ways that we speak, cannot make rights claims in the way in which we understand. Can we actually consider them also subjects of making rights claims, and on whose behalf and in whose authority we would be ascribing to flora and fauna, the earth itself, the possibilities of agency, and to be able to take rightful place in the community of peoples around the world. How do we think about that? I think Donna Haraway's work is really significant in terms of thinking interspecies politics. And Will Kimlicka's work on, for example, the possibility of thinking animals as right-bearing subjects. Right-bearing not in the sense we understand, but right-bearing in the sense that it is transformed now, a transformed conception of rights that are not necessarily claimed by those agents themselves, or at least in the sense we understand them. There are indigenous cosmologies that we can also draw on, in where, for example, indigenous people think about their bodies being the site of where rivers flow for millennia, that their bodies actually embody already rivers, is not a language that we immediately recognize in political theory and philosophy, but indigenous cosmology allows us to have a different kind of relationship with the earth, and the earth as a space in which we care for ourselves and for others. So care of the earth becomes care of ourselves, care of each other, and this is an absolute necessity for addressing climate change and the earth politics, if you like. That reminds me of Bruno Latour's work as well. So there's good work that's taking place that opens up possibilities. I mentioned people whose work do not necessarily rely on, even draw on the concept of citizenship. Case in point is Donna Haraway and Bruno Latour. But at the same time, I think there are interesting parallels and solidarities between these forms of thinking. In the end, we are also thinking about the earth, thinking about relationship with other species. We are rethinking about ourselves and the kinds of beings that we are. As we think the kinds of beings that we are, inevitably, the kinds of beings that politically we are comes to the table. What kinds of political beings are we? On whose behalf can we do any act? Can we perform any act? Can we establish solidarities that go beyond already imposed borders of, as we tackle these multiple challenges? One that you mentioned, of course, climate change and earth, and yet at the same time, one that is really quite significant to me, out of control global arms trade and out of control nationalism and far-right fascism about bloodlines and blood-based understanding of community. How do we establish? Perhaps establishing relationship with other species to demonstrate that we ought not to be talking only about ourselves and our differences, but we are, after all, inhabitants of this earth with other species. I don't know if that helps, Erica.
Excellent. Well, Erica, did you want to come back?
No, that's thank you very much. That was very inspiring. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks.
Thank
well,
you.
The next set of questions, one of them, the first one is actually sort of following on the thread, and I'll read it out. I'm going to do the thing again of reading out three questions. They're perhaps quite different, and we're getting to the point, I think, also where it's okay for you to pick and choose which questions you want to ask, and maybe we'll try and continue the discussion in other ways. So the first one is from Katja May, who says, thank you. Rather than trying to decolonize citizenship, wouldn't it be the more obviously radical or transformative act to do away with the concept of citizenship and instead think about alternative (indigenous) concepts such as kinship? In other words, even though there is a long history of decolonizing citizenship as well as of deconstructing its universalism, it seems to be an ultimately Western concept that has colonized the world. That's the first question. The next question, on a completely different scale, perhaps, from Liran M, says, can you please expand more on the dynamics of Ottoman Jimmy status in North Africa in the 10th to 20th centuries? Your paper surprised me in that it suggests that the Jimmy excuse my pronunciation, category for religious minorities under Ottoman Empire was actually constituted by Western powers wanting to drive a wedge between the majority group in Ottoman territories and religious minorities. Yet conventional wisdom suggests that jimmis were actually an Islamic jurisprudential category to designate people of the book, that's to say Christians and Jews living in Muslim lands. This seems to contrast with your description of the jimmi category in quasi-colonized Ottoman territories. Not the 10th to the 20th centuries, the 19th to the 20th centuries. Next question, the third one in this bunch, from Philip Howell, who says, really enjoyed the talk and the associated papers. I have a question about the welfare state, comparing martial and social citizenship, presumably the empire state in the later 20th century. Do we then have to decolonize the progressive story we in the UK and elsewhere tell about the welfare state? Should we say that the welfare state is the empire state? Can we still hold on to the progressive or left version of citizenship's expansion?
Thank you. Thank you. Three really difficult questions. Excellent questions. And again, I try to be really succinct, but I'm not really doing a good job at that. I think I'm extending my answers, partly because these are so good, such good questions. I'm thinking aloud with them. Okay, Katya's question is really a challenging question. Decolonizing citizenship, do away with the concept of citizenship, isn't it Western? Katya, it's not, this is a question that's been dogging me for some time, so much so that I have undertaken a very large project to look into specifically the second part of your question. Isn't citizenship a Western construct? Interestingly, my answer after that project was, and the project was called Citizenship After Orientalism, because Orientalism sets citizenship apart from any other political subjectivity and ascribes to it Western individuality, that it is a Western phenomenon. So it's retelling the narrative that it constitutes. In fact, when you go and look at the founding fathers of social sciences and humanities, legal history, Max Weber and others, but particularly Max Weber, when you look at his conception of citizenship, when he says that it is uniquely Western, but even more so saying that only because Western modernity invented citizenship that it progressed. All others were not able to overcome what he calls fissiparous and tribal identities. And with tribal identity so rampant in places in Africa, in the Middle East, in Asia, and South America, modernity with the figure of modern citizenship would not have been possible. So there's a strange dominant view here of definitely Said would call Orientalist and imperial conception that European exceptionalism, a Eurocentric conception of citizenship. So at one level, what you said, isn't citizenship Western, is also itself Orientalist and Eurocentric conception of citizenship before we explore what is the substance of citizenship and what happens when people perform citizenship. Can we actually find citizenship where the word itself is not present, but the practice is? These were the heuristic heuristic propositions of a large-scale project I've undertaken from 2010 to 2015 for about 5 years. In various continents, we have done work and genealogically and historically investigated various practices that we thought that were not necessarily considered as citizenship, but actually they were incipient conception of citizenship. I'm going to come to Philip's question about the welfare state. For example, we found certain practices of trust, establishing trust in the name of God in order to enable elite and not so elite people to be able to redistribute resources that in Eastern especially in Islamic countries, this is never called social citizenship, but I have come very close to arguing that this is social citizenship. There is no other way. It's social citizenship in Ottoman Empire existed for 3 centuries. And Waqf, the trust, was the main mechanism through which it was delivered. But Orientalist and Eurocentric literature will not recognize it as citizenship. It expects to find citizenship in the way in which its dominant language understands it. So we've got a dilemma here. Either we just accept the dominant language of citizenship and say it doesn't exist, and so shouldn't we look elsewhere? Shouldn't we do away with citizenship and create different alternative possibilities? Or there's also work to be done recovering subjugated knowledges that are not necessarily, knowledges and practices that are not necessarily understood or conceived in terms of language of citizenship, and yet nonetheless, they are citizenship practices. This is the heuristic performative move that one can do. Well, I think my answer, where I came to, Katya, is that the answer does not have to be either or. It is not a question of doing away with citizenship, because we have instituted a history of its 2,000 years. I don't know if any political theorist or activist should necessarily have the ambition to say that let's get rid of and do away an institution that has been so long habituating us to certain forms of political acting and political subjectivity through which we claim rights. Rights that we may not have, rights that we may have been given previously, but we perform them, we claim them. This is a significant element that has to be maintained. So this is one part of it. But at the same time, we can say that in the way in which we understand citizenship, yes, it's Eurocentric and Western-centric. In the process, we can find other political activities, political practices, subjectivities from places, non-European places. I have given an example of something that Walter Mignolo did in his decolonial thinking, or The Dark Side of Modernity. He gives a very good example of South American empires having developed a certain conception of city, so radically different from the conception of city that pertain in the West, as Max Weber describes it. But Walter Mignolo says both can be called city, but South American historical form of city is something different. And so we have to bring that conception of the city into our understanding of the city and change, transform now what we mean by the city. It is a different move than what Weber did. Weber also went through all different forms of cities also, as well as citizenship. But his decision was that, no, I don't find any element of citizenship in the East. None whatsoever. There isn't. It didn't exist. And for good reason, because in regressive places, you cannot have it. That was his sort of answer. So the closest I've come to deal with the issue of why don't we do away with citizenship is Derridean notion of working with concepts under erasure. What that means is that we don't have to actually to use another concept from Foucault. We don't have to take the Enlightenment blackmail and make a decision, either or decision, saying this has got to be way or this has got to be way. We can be flexible with Derrida. When we're working with concepts under erasure, we accept that they have history, and then it serves a certain function, it performs a certain function, some of which is negative, some of which are positive. And yet at the same time, we're aspiring to perhaps erase so that new concepts, new practices can come under a different label. And this is a deconstructive process where we cannot at any given point in time say that we're doing away with one and adopting another one. It's a transformative re-signification process that, with all its tensions and paradoxes, has to be taken together with all the sensitivities that it requires. I do hope that it responds to your question. It does come from years of being troubled by that question, and yet being unable to take one or the other side of it and working at the edge of it, walking on the sword edge, as it were, and trying not to fall one way or the other, and at the same time hurting as I walk. I mix the metaphors, I always do, but you know what I mean. The question about the Islamic Zimmi, it's really difficult one. It is really pointed question. It's very precise. I appreciate it, and I hope I didn't catch the name of the person who asked it, but I hope you will make contact with me and we will continue the conversation. But one thing that you said that my paper surprised you because you thought that the Western empire states actually have created these categories of people in other places, which led to the invention of the notion of minority. And minority means that they were God's people, and they were peoples of the book, or spiritual people, and then their rights were protected in the minority. That is the grand narrative. What I'm saying is that actually extraterritoriality really pushed that narrative to materialize. So instead of reading that politics as minority majority, I'm very much interested in how the very idea of minority was created at a distance as belonging to people of our own kind, as it were. So it's not a question of giving them rights, giving these people rights, but also taking certain rights. Some historians, for example, argue that before the invention of minority in Ottoman Empire, under also in Zimmi category, millet system actually were able to negotiate differences amongst these different people without the language of minority and majority. And isn't there something that we can learn from the millet system that actually overcomes this dichotomy of minority majority? I think it is worth thinking about without lapsing into Ottomanism, which is a long story, but I'm going to mark it as a danger. But without lapsing into Ottomanism, there is something to be thought about. How is it that certain differences were negotiated under different categories and with different language came to be transformed to a different language of minority and majority? And what did empire states have to benefit from that transformation is the question I want to ask. I hope we will revisit that conversation. Philip, I've had your question in mind when I was answering Katya's and the question of the other, because I have already sent you signs saying that, you know, this either or issue, to cut to the chase and answer your question definitively and affirmatively. Yes, we can maintain a certain leftist conception of rights as an expansion of repertoires of entitlements in the name of working classes or other marginalized and discriminated groups, and maintain those social rights as our rights to be expanded around the world, but it has to start somewhere. So it is not a question of waiting until such time that when we establish global citizenship just the way we want, and then the social rights will be allocated in cosmopolitan principles, is not the kind of teleological view that I would subscribe to. There are various struggles that have to be fought at various registers and different temporalities. The rights that have been won under the auspices of, even when we call it empire state, by the left, by the struggles of working classes, have to be maintained and expanded. That's why I do maintain sort of the Marshallian investment in the question of rights and expansion of them, even if we differentiate them, as we expand them, we resignify them, we transform them, but still, these are the rights that we want to maintain. So a progressively expanding rights rather than selectively leaving some behind so that we are finding more dynamic rights would be a folly to commit, I think. So in any polity, I would even expand this to, for example, EU as a polity. Whatever its failings, whatever its flaws are, under the EU, certain rights have been obtained, certain rights have been struggled for and won. And I am not willing to let them go. Only if the project is to expand them to others, expand them substantively, territorially, and deepen them. That is the project. Similarly, one can say that United Nations politics of human rights has been nothing but to institutionalize the nation state in the international law and international order. And it has not done much to critically question, for example, categories of statelessness, refugees, despite global compacts on refugee crisis, global compact on migration, and so on. And yet, at the same time, under its auspices, certain rights repertoires have been made available for activists under which they can actually make rights claims. I know and studied various forms of it. For example, Kurdish people have been one of the most active users in the 1990s and early 2000s, bringing their cases to European Convention of Human Rights and making rights claims about their language rights and so on that were not available in the auspices of the Turkish state. And the rights that they won, the rights that they were able to articulate are the rights that are significant to maintain, although the repertoire from which they were drawn needs to be also transformed. So it is not one way or the other, but rights that have been won ought not let go. That is really important. So the answer to the question is that can we hold on to the left version of rights? Yes, Decolonizing project is also the project of the working classes and their achievements, on whose shoulders we are standing, without centuries of struggles, extending back not only the working classes as we recognize in modern life, but ancient Greek slaves, the poor, ancient Roman Republican and imperial poor, the struggles that they have waged to be able to benefit from the rights and expanding citizenship questions is part of working class history. And that has to be maintained. We have to maintain that in view. I hope I made that commitment pretty clear.
Thanks very much. So I think this is going to have to be the last round of questions. So there may be more than three. What I'll do is I'll read out the questions and then we'll turn to the person with the hand up. So you'll be the last one. I'm afraid going to jump over one question that's in the chat because you've already asked a question. So just to enable the maximum number of people to contribute. So the first question comes from Robbie Rubino Vigar, and it is, what is the impact of extraterritoriality on the development and uptake of narratives of exclusionary nationalism by the host state? Question mark. Okay, the next question is, I'm going to Dino Kadic. I wonder if there is a form of citizenship in practice that exists that does not rely in some way on a hierarchy of value. If it's a move that creates inclusions and exclusions, presumably those are based on a notion of a value and a hierarchy of value. And then the next question is, hi, it's from Sarah Hughes. It says, hi Engin, thank you for the talk. Oh, I'm not sure if we'll have time for the question. I wanted to ask about the future archives of citizenship. So much of your work is grounded within archival research. With the changing of archival practices of nation states, for example, Trump, Estonia, etc., how do we archive attempts to decolonize citizenship today? And I think, so we can now also move to Zaki Nahabu to ask you to give your question.
Hello, Engin. Thank you for the talk. It was an excellent talk, by the way, and it's good to see you. So exactly. My question is perhaps a big question, a broad question, but is it useful to draw a distinction between decolonizing citizenship and decolonial citizenship? And if so, where could we find decolonial citizenship? Because I think the argument presented so far is very convincing in terms of decolonizing citizenship. And it's always going to be a process. It's always going to be something that is done, activated, enacted. But have we got any examples of decolonial citizenship? Or is it not, or doesn't it fall into that kind of ontological status of a decolonial citizenship? Does it not have that stability, like multicultural citizenship or feminist citizenship? Is it more like queering citizenship or more of a process?
Thanks, Zaki. Again, really good 4 questions. Okay, let me just address them in order that they have been posed. Robbie asked, what is the impact of extraterritoriality on exclusionary nationalism of the empire state? I think it is significant. The notion of claiming people at a distance I think generates a double move. On the one hand, it creates this notion of the exceptionalism of the home state, that there is something back home that is worth maintaining and valuing. This notion of a homeland, as I mentioned, it does generate at a distance. So there's an imaginary, if nation state was an imaginary community, it's imaginary citizenship here that is based on a homeland and within the boundaries. It creates the first move of the double move is that. And second, it creates people who participate in that imaginary at a distance. Although they may be elsewhere, they practice their homeland citizenship in wherever they are. And we often see this bursting into the surface in unexpected and surprising ways. So for example, during the pandemic, repatriating our own citizens from other countries. And all of a sudden, these expectations that have been put on states, why don't you pick us up? Why don't you collect us? Why don't you repatriate? It's an important entitlement. It's an important claim, but it just comes to the surface that actually not one single state, or at least not one single empire state, is not exactly where it's supposed to be. It has its tentacles in the form of other peoples in various patchwork spaces around the world. And this creates this double move of creating people with affiliation and loyalty to homeland, and homeland that is something that maintains and holds the center. This double move does create exclusionary nationalism. That's where citizenship becomes really an exclusionary practice. When people are in need, states absolutely have no inhibition whatsoever to draw the line between citizens and non-citizens. Pandemic nationalism is a good example of that as well. And the jostling and the competition amongst states to obtain the vaccine first, and then also play the global savior, is such an intense example of this extraterritoriality. So it's a significant impact, I think, but it is really like understudied. This needs to be studied. I made these propositions, and colonial historians studied extraterritoriality, but extraterritoriality needs to be also studied as a contemporary practice, not just historical practice. Dino, this is a little bit actually part of Zaki's question. Dino says, can there be a form of citizenship in practice that does not endorse hierarchy? This is Zaki's way of saying, can you give an example of a decolonial citizenship? Okay, decolonizing is the process by which we critique, transform, and so on the existing citizenship, but can you give an example? Well, I'm going to give a couple of examples. One has a lineage that goes back to well into early 1960s and 50s, which is associated with resistance politics, politics for peace, against Vietnam, against war. When you go back, University of California, Berkeley, student speeches, the kinds of things they've done. There are many footages of this available on YouTube. The famous speech, "Are we the cogs in a machine?" When you look at those footage and as well as read the literature from that period and about that period, and then extend that practice of resistance, demonstration, and protest from universities and to 1970s. Again, anti-war activism, environmental activism, anti-racist activism, Black activism, queer activism, women's activism. In each of these movements, we read them movements, but when you look at the kinds of practices that they upheld, there are remarkable similarities, that there's a certain, what Derrida and Butler would have called, signification, resignification, and citational practices of maintaining a democratic decolonial form of citizenship that eschews hierarchies, eschews inequalities, eschews differentiated involvements. It is hypersensitive and hyper committed to flat hierarchies. And then you fast forward when you see, for example, the activism under direct action during the Occupy, whether it is in Madrid, whether it's in Barcelona, whether it's in London, or in Tahrir Square during the Arab Spring, or in New York. You see certain repertoires being repeated in terms of speech styles. And then recently in Extinction Rebellion, when I visited various their sites in both London and Paris before the pandemic, the resemblances were uncanny in the way in which they were passed over from generation to generation. So one major example then from the last 60 years or so, I would say that the language of protest, demonstration, manifestation across the world that has taken the form, and it has actually shown the glimpses of direct democracy, decolonial democracy. It has maintained certain commitment to these values. And it took also semi-institutionalized forms in World Economic Forum or in protest against G7 and G20 and so on. So they keep coming back. There is a memory, as it were. There is an institutionalized global memory of remembering what does it mean to practice decolonial democratic practice. That I very strongly believe as an example. Other example from let's say the, other places from the global South, one which I have studied, a decolonial citizenship. I'm quite intrigued by the institution of trust, or in Ottoman or Persian or Arabic combination of it, Waqf. Waqf as an institution providing some form of citizenship. I am quite intrigued by how the practices were organized, quasi-legalized over a very long period, so much so that legal historians say that English institution of trust actually a direct imitation and continuation of Waqf, and that actually took over, resignified, transformed it, and turned it into a different practice. So these two, one historical and from global South, one from maybe Eurocentric, but the protests. But you see this in Hong Kong, for example, that language of decolonial direct democracy that is embodies, it is quite inspiring to see globally maintained in memory. That takes me to the question Sarah asked on future archives of citizenship, archiving decolonizing citizenship. Maybe I was given examples like by saying that there is a collective memory from 1960s onwards, maybe even earlier, of archives of how do we behave when we carve out spaces where we suspend the powers that be. We are with one another. We created an autonomous space. We have temporarily emancipated ourselves. This used to be called, way back when, this used to be called TAZ, temporary academic, not academic, what a slip, Freudian slip, temporary autonomous zones. This is the temporary academic space, now what we're doing through the Zoom. Anyway, these TAZ, temporary autonomous zones where emancipation is not an ideal, but actually practice, are the archives. Now, archives in the collective memory. But Sarah's question about, well, how can we maintain, how can we establish future archives to maintain, well, the online world is really a good example of this. I'm gonna give you an example from a classroom I had today with my students, students of Frontiers of International Politics here in the University of London Institute in Paris. We looked at Idle No More movement between 2012 and 2013, the indigenous people, and now they articulated this today, what this movement was about. You've got this much many minutes to write a 200-word essay right now and post it to the forum. Although we are teaching face-to-face, I was using online forum. And do, what did I say? I said, go and attack the web and do the search. They were amazed what they were able to find. So the movements are actually using the web as a way of archiving their activities. So there's an ongoing digital archives that are being established, quite messy, organic, and flat hierarchies. There are not working links and so on, but it is very strong. Perhaps it is about time in some ways that we can institutionalize some of this, which I had as a dream project that I never really fully acted on, establishing like archives of decolonial citizenship. And then finally, Zaki, I think I have given you some implicit answers in giving answers to Robbie, Dino, and Sarah. First of all, your question is there useful distinction to be made between decolonizing and decolonial citizenship? Yes, absolutely. I absolutely agree with that, because decolonizing, with those three moments that I have articulated, gives you a sense of process, like a political project, but it doesn't give you much sense of what to aspire to, what, if not some formal definition, which I think would be dangerous, but at least certain forms that we can aspire to. We know what decolonial citizenship looks like when we see it. Archiving that concept. And I think to be able to maintain that, to keep a distinction between decolonizing and decolonial citizenship is very helpful. So thanks very much for bringing that to my attention. I did not necessarily think of it, partly because I think I avoid something to aspire to, but actually a permanent critique of that which exists, the decolonizing citizenship. Investment is into just deconstructing it, historicizing it, overturning it, constantly just taking it apart, but putting it back together, I think can be subsumed with the concept decolonial citizenship. And along with Sarah's notion of archive, there is definitely a project there. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. What a great place to finish. Fabulous. We've hit our time limit. So I just want to say, before the vote of thanks and everybody sort of pops off, just to say, please continue the discussion, everybody, with future seminars. Keep an eye on the CRASSH site, and we'll keep you posted on what's going on. But I must just say, thank you so much to Engin Isin for a really wonderful talk, really thought-provoking, really sort of stimulating, and thank you all to you for fabulous questions as well. And well, give you a kind of virtual round of applause and say goodbye to those who participated.
I'm clapping all of you who participated. Thanks so much. It was really fabulous 2 hours.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed it. Thanks so much.
Great. So did we. Fantastic.